Hello, and welcome to Cities Skyrim, the Cities Skylines series that fast forwards the lore of the Elder Scrolls by a few thousand years so it would be applicable to our own history. The year now is 6th Era 1830. As mentioned in the previous episode, some brilliant scientists had managed to reverse engineer ancient Dwemer technology, unlocking the secrets of steam power. One of those inventors, Belethor, saw the potential of steam power in earning him a decent amount of gold. Soon his steam trains brought steam-powered machines across Tamriel. Belethor, however, while a cunning businessman, had little understanding of patents, and in his quest for gold managed to sell these patents to a random traveler, after proudly proclaiming that everything's for sale. This traveler decided to sell copies of Belethor's patents and blueprints, and soon steam power became more accessible than ever. This brought about the first wave of permanent expansion to Whiterun since the lower parts of the city were settled a few centuries prior. Waves of industrial workers needed some place to stay, so dense housing was built around the new factories. When it came to the construction of railways, there was little concern for safety. New lines were built where it was most convenient for the companies, and only the walled part of the city was out of bounds for them. Lines would often follow along the streets, and it wasn't rare to have a line go through the backyards of tenement buildings. All in all, this created miserable conditions for the recently freed serfs. People, mostly men, working in the factories and on the railroads would in most cases be paid in whatever commodity they were producing, which around Whiterun was alcohol. Workers were kept in line by mercenaries hired by the factory owners or even regular soldiers, but long working hours ensured that nobody had neither time or energy to organize a strike or general upheaval. Eventually, the mercenaries and soldiers would be replaced by an organized police force, replacing the traditional down guard. These police officers were mainly tasked with solving crimes such as murder, theft, and yes, organized labor. The punishment for latter was often a one-way ticket to Solstheim or the ashlands of Vardenfell. However, industrialization in the Dunmer-controlled areas was not as rapid as the rest of the known world. The abolishment of serfdom was a symbolic move, as right after that the local nobles decided that for their freedom, these peasants were now in debt to them and also had to pay rent. These debts were usually astronomically high, meaning that it would take decades to pay off. Those who did not move to the cities only did so out of the grace of the local landlord, and until the late 1860s the landlord was still allowed to force peasants to work on his lands. Besides collecting debt payments and rent money, landlords found another way to get rich, and fast. Mead and other alcoholic drinks were in high demand, and they were producing the raw materials. At first, landlords would sell most of their grain to Morrowind, but eventually decided that they'd get much wealthier if they started to produce spirits themselves. Rudimentary vodka kitchens popped up all across Skyrim. This was profitable at first, but after the Breton Wars of the 1810s, grain production, and with that vodka production, was kicked into such high gear that by 1820 a barrel of vodka was cheaper than the grain needed to make it. This forced landlords to actually improve their production methods. You see, it isn't capitalism that breeds innovation. Innovation under capitalism usually happens to either prevent a looming disaster or deal with said disaster. Otherwise, old production methods stay in place until either expansion is required or the inefficiencies become all too clear. Anyway, these new machines allowed landlords to get filthy rich from vodka, and the imperial government was buying most of it for internal and external trade. Eventually, it was alcohol that made up 60% of all industrial production in Skyrim, and factories in the cities began to facilitate this production by providing machinery, parts, means of transportation, and so on. Whiterun became an important railway hub, and at its peak, 100 trains passed through here weekly, loaded to the brim with Skyrim's industrial goods. The imperial government made sure that the sale of vodka was under its tight control, as the lack of government employees meant that taxes were left mostly uncollected. By selling alcohol, the imperial government had a steady revenue stream, as it was cheap and in high demand. The imperial alcohol monopoly meant that breweries and distilleries had a steady market, and the government managed to cover 1/4 of its annual budget. This also meant that workers were finally paid in actual currency, but the quality of life did not improve by a whole lot. However, in the countryside, some peasants started to take out mortgages to buy out their own farmstead, or sometimes there were farmsteads for sale. Between 1860 and 1875, the quality of life for peasants improved considerably, as new laws granted them more rights and freedoms, especially in front of the landlords. It should be said, however, that the imperial government did not grant peasants these rights out of the kindness of their hearts, but it was instead pressured to do so after a series of peasant revolts both inside the empire and across Tamriel. After all, the Empire of Morrowind shared a border with the Breton Republic, and ideas were fast to spread, especially considering that most peasants had been given a basic education since 1690 and were able to read and write. Ironically, Dunmer nobles themselves were fascinated by the Breton Enlightenment ideas and instigated some reforms as long as their own power wasn't threatened. Most Dunmer and Nord nobles hired governesses from High Rock and emulated their culture whenever possible. This created a cultural rift between the ruling classes and the commoners, and alienation between the two classes became ever more clear by the end of the 19th century. The peasant and worker classes themselves had a sort of a cultural awakening. Educated Nords started to speak of cultural autonomy, the preservation of Nord culture and traditions, and most importantly, Nord self-determination. You see, even though the Dunmer were fascinated with Breton culture, it was more like Breton culture with strong Dunmer characteristics, and during the course of Dunmer rule in Skyrim, a policy of Dunmerification was instituted. Nord culture wasn't outright outlawed, but all institutions had to follow Dunmer customs. This was met by fierce resistance by the local Nords, who founded their own culture associations and began holding their own festivities to install Nord identity. This isn't to say that Nord culture had disappeared, but the identity mostly had. Merchants in the cities often considered themselves either Breton or Iratilic, and most peasants just called themselves peasants. This wave of national awakening in Skyrim was only a part of the growing nationalism across Tamriel. National self-identity became the new force in uniting nations and eventually forming and breaking apart empires. By the end of the 19th century, most Nords were still peasants. The cities were a scene of a great socioeconomic divide that served as a powder keg for events to come. The working classes were increasingly unhappy with their living standards, and Nords in general started to resist Dunmer rule. The upcoming century would become a time of great troubles for the city of Whiterun, but also a time of great development. Thank you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed enough to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I do like making this series and would like to thank my therapist and close friends who encouraged me to start this series. And of course, if you really liked it, maybe share it with others, so more people could see this and give me a sense of purpose in making these. Anyway, on to the cinematics.